You have rehearsed this moment so many times that you know which sentence comes next. The escalation follows a pattern. The silence lands on schedule, and somewhere around the third hour you know exactly how it ends. Not well, but predictably. And later, when you find yourself composing the version of your life where you simply don't return, something quietly interrupts the picture. The next day in the old place is already visible, already mapped. The first day in the new one has no floor plan at all. Introduction. There is a particular kind of orientation that pain can provide. When the cost of a situation has been paid so many times that the invoice is familiar, the mind begins to treat the payment schedule itself as a form of stability. This is not weakness. It is a functional response to an environment whose terms, however damaging, are at least known. Predictability carries a quiet authority that has nothing to do with whether the predicted thing is good. The confusion that keeps people anchored to painful circumstances is rarely simple cowardice or poor self-regard. It emerges from a genuine perceptual problem. Familiarity and safety can feel indistinguishable from the inside. Both reduce anxiety. Both lower the effort required to move through a day. The difference between them is consequential, but it is not always legible, especially when the unfamiliar alternative has never been tested and therefore carries no evidence at all, only imagination. What this primer offers is not a directive about where you should live, who you should remain with, or which life you should choose. It offers something more immediately useful: criteria for reading the difference between a structure that protects you and a structure that merely predicts you, along with a method for gathering real evidence from the untested territory without dismantling everything at once. The question running underneath all of it is one worth sitting with from the beginning. How does something painful come to feel safer than a possibility that might offer you more? Chapter 1. The comfort of prediction. Consider a conflict that has repeated itself in the same relationship or workplace for years. By now you could speak both sides of it. The particular grievance, the defensive pivot, the moment when the other person's voice shifts register, the silence that follows, the partial repair that holds until the next iteration, all of it arrives on a known schedule. The first time this happened, it was disorienting. The 15th time, it was simply the thing that happens on certain Tuesday evenings, or after certain kinds of meetings, or whenever a particular threshold is crossed. What that repetition produces is not comfort in any positive sense, but something that functions similarly: the reduction of surprise. Surprise requires the mind to reassess, reroute, and generate new responses under pressure. Familiar conflict, by contrast, activates responses that have already been rehearsed. You know what tone to use. You know which door to close, which argument to drop before it escalates further, which concession will move things toward the end of the episode. This is genuine cognitive economy, and the body experiences it as something closer to ease than agony, even when the content of the situation is painful. Over time, those survival strategies become automatic. The careful positioning, the advanced reading of moods, the mental rehearsal of likely scenarios. None of it requires deliberate effort anymore. It has been compressed into reflex. Walking into a familiar, difficult environment feels manageable in a way that a new, pleasant environment may not, precisely because the difficult one has been walked into hundreds of times before and survived each time. What emerges from this process is a mistaken but understandable sense of control. The situation continues to cause harm, but the harm lands on a known timetable and responds, at least partially, to practiced maneuvers. This begins to register as something like competence, and competence, even competence in managing a bad situation, carries its own gravity. Leaving requires not only tolerating the unfamiliar, it requires giving up the fluency that has been so carefully built inside the familiar. The question this opens is subtle. If the control you have developed is the ability to navigate recurring damage, what exactly are you controlling? There is an important distinction between predicting harm and preventing it. In a workplace where a particular supervisor reliably dismisses certain kinds of contributions, an experienced employee learns not to bring those contributions in that format to that room. The anticipation is accurate. The harm, the dismissal, the invisibility, The quiet erosion of professional confidence is not prevented. It is predicted, and the prediction allows a preparation that reduces the shock. Reduced shock is not the same as protection. This pattern appears in relationships with equal clarity. When one person has learned to read another's volatility well enough to calibrate behavior around it, the volatility continues. What changes is only the quality of the warning signal. The managed distance, the careful phrasing, the early exit from conversations heading in a dangerous direction, these are adaptive responses, and they reflect real intelligence. But they also represent a life organized around a recurring threat, rather than a life protected from one. The particular relief that accurate anticipation provides is real and should not be dismissed. When you predict correctly that a meeting will go poorly, and you have already prepared the emotional insulation, the landing is softer than it would have been. That softer landing is experienced as something working, even when what is working is merely your damage management system rather than the environment itself. The environment has not improved. Your tolerance for it has become more efficient. This efficiency can be mistaken for evidence that the situation is manageable in a meaningful sense. Manageable in the sense of survivable, yes. Manageable in the sense of safe or growing or responsive to your actual needs, that requires a different examination. The preparation required to function in a damaging environment is real labor, and real labor feels like capability. The question is whether that capability is being spent on a structure worth sustaining. What tends to form around this kind of preparation is a role, a defined position in the ecosystem of the known situation. And the role itself becomes a source of identity that is very difficult to separate from the environment in which it was built. Within familiar, painful environments, distinct roles tend to crystallize. The fixer arrives early to assess the damage and repair what can be repaired before anyone else notices. The appeaser monitors emotional weather and adjusts their own behavior to prevent escalation. The invisible worker delivers reliably and takes up as little social space as possible to avoid becoming a target. The reliable one absorbs the responsibilities that would otherwise go unmet, earning stability through indispensability. Each of these roles is coherent. Each carries a logic that made sense when it was first formed. What they share is a rehearsed response to a specific type of pressure. The fixer does not have to think about whether to fix. The impulse arrives before the decision. The appeaser has already calculated several conciliatory moves before the conversation has begun. These are not character flaws. They are competencies developed in a particular training environment, and they function well in that environment precisely because they were built there. The problem surfaces when the familiar setting is removed. Without the specific pressure that the role was designed to address, the rehearsed response has no target. The fixer in a functional environment where things rarely break catastrophically does not know what to do with the absence of emergency. The appeaser in a relationship that does not require constant emotional management feels oddly underutilized, even slightly anxious, as though the peace is temporary and something ought to be done about it. The unfamiliar setting does not simply feel new. It feels like a place where the competency does not apply, and therefore where the person does not quite fit. This is a critical perceptual distortion. Competence in surviving a particular environment is not evidence that the environment is the right one. A person who has become expert at navigating a difficult current is not most at home in turbulent water. They have simply spent the most time there. The expertise is real. The evidence it provides about where they belong is false. Identity, once organized around a role, begins to defend the setting that makes the role necessary. Leaving becomes not only a practical disruption, but an existential one. Outside the known environment, the question of who you are when no one needs fixing, appeasing, invisibility, or reliability becomes genuinely uncomfortable. The old pain at least told you what your function was. That orientation, however costly, is very hard to give up without something to replace it, which is where the body comes in, because the role does not only exist in thought, it has been built into the physical rhythm of daily life. Chapter 2. The Body of Habit. The route to a job held for a decade requires almost no conscious navigation. The turns arrive before the decision to make them. The parking space, the door, the hallway, the particular sound of the building in the morning. None of it demands attention, and that absence of demand is experienced as a kind of ease. Similarly, the familiar room in a difficult household has a texture that the body knows. The specific quality of the silence, the sound of certain footsteps, the light at a particular hour. This knowledge is not pleasant, but it is effortless in a way that novelty is not. Repeated experience radically reduces the decision effort required to enter a situation. In a new environment, every detail requires processing. Where to stand, how to calibrate the tone, what the norms are, which behaviors will be read as competent and which as intrusive. In a known environment, even a painful one, most of those decisions have already been made and stored. The mind moves through on a well-worn track, and the freed capacity can be used for other things, including the anticipation and management of whatever difficulty is coming. This ease of entry is frequently mistaken for evidence of rightness. Something is comfortable to approach, and so it feels appropriate. The confusion is understandable. Ease does feel like a positive signal, but ease measures familiarity, not suitability. A well-traveled road through difficult terrain is still difficult terrain. The traveler is simply no longer surprised by the obstacles. A household chore that has been done the same way for 20 years takes almost no effort to begin. So does walking into a conversation that will be painful. The morning commute to a draining position flows with the same low-friction quality as a commute to a genuinely good one, because the friction is in the situation, not the route. The body does not distinguish between familiar and beneficial. It distinguishes between rehearsed and unrehearsed, and it experiences rehearsed as safe. This is the mechanism that makes the emotional baseline so powerful and so difficult to examine honestly. In a familiar environment, even the emotional responses arrive on a predictable schedule, the particular weight that settles in on Sunday evenings before a difficult work week, the tightening that comes when a specific name appears on a phone screen, the dull flattening of affect after a familiar disappointment. These emotions are unpleasant, but they are known, and what is known is expected, and what is expected does not need to be renegotiated every time it arrives. The feeling lands, is recognized, and is handled with an already prepared response. This anticipation reduces what might be called emotional disorganization. A grief that has been felt many times is not easier, but it is more navigable than a grief being felt for the first time. The same applies to recurring frustration, recurring longing, recurring resignation. They have edges the person already understands. The exit, even if not relief, is at least familiar, and the return to whatever passes for equilibrium in that environment follows a route the person has traveled before. Contrast this with the emotional texture of genuine hope. Hope involves an outcome not yet confirmed, which means it also involves the possibility of its own reversal. A person who has organized their emotional life around expected disappointment does not have practice processing real hope, including hope's specific vulnerability to loss. The unfamiliar emotion is not necessarily worse, but it is less legible, and what is less legible can feel more threatening, regardless of what it actually offers. The comparison between familiar sadness and unfamiliar hope is not an argument that sadness is preferable. It is an observation about how the emotional economy of a known life can make the emotional exposure of an untested life feel disproportionately risky. The risk is real, even if the calculation distorts it. An emotion that has never been practiced requires something of a person that their current emotional training has not prepared them for, which is one reason why imagining alternatives can feel dangerous even before a single practical step has been taken. The cost of this system becomes visible when the expected emotions begin arriving so automatically that they feel structural, like weather conditions attached to a particular geography, rather than responses to specific events. When that happens, the distinction between the emotion and the environment producing it becomes very hard to maintain, and that loss of distinction is precisely what makes alternative possibilities feel so loud with threat. A life being considered from the outside has no script. There are no rehearsed lines for the first morning in a new city, the first week in a new role, the first conversation in a community where nobody yet knows your name or your history. The familiar life offers a character with established relationships, known rules, a position in a social order, and a set of practiced responses. The possible life offers a blank, and the mind, encountering a blank, fills it. It fills it with financial uncertainty first, because that is the most legible form of practical risk. Then with social uncertainty. Who will this make you to the people whose opinions have structured your days? Then with identity uncertainty, which is often the deepest. If you are no longer performing the role that has given your life its shape, what exactly remains? These are not imaginary concerns. Some portion of each is grounded in genuine unknowns. But the mind tends not to stop at the genuine unknown. It moves from the real gap into worst-case projection, and worst-case projection has the emotional texture of certainty. The old life, by contrast, is rendered in full detail. Every inconvenience is known. Every cost has been experienced. The familiar pain is specific. This particular conversation, this particular monthly shortfall, this particular diminishment on this particular afternoon. The possible life's pain is vague but vast, filling all the unscripted space with imagined versions of catastrophe that have never been tested and therefore cannot be corrected by evidence. This asymmetry distorts any honest comparison between options. A detailed picture of something difficult competes with a blurred picture of something possibly better, and detail wins almost every time as an emotional anchor. The familiar has been lived and survived. The unfamiliar may produce something that has never yet been survived, or so the projection goes. What would allow a more honest assessment is the possibility of comparing the two lives with equal resolution. That requires contact with the unfamiliar that is bounded, reversible and genuinely informative. Not imagination, not projection, but actual evidence gathered in controlled conditions. Before that becomes possible, however, it is worth examining more carefully what the familiar situation is actually costing and what terms were ever agreed to. Chapter 3. The known pain contract. Every arrangement that has persisted through repeated pain carries an implicit contract. The terms are not written, but they are legible in behavior. This job requires a particular kind of self-suppression in exchange for a particular kind of security. This relationship requires a particular distribution of emotional labor in exchange for a particular form of continuity. This family role requires a particular allocation of time and priority in exchange for belonging and recognition. The costs are known. The receipts are filed. The system operates on a schedule that, however draining, can be planned around. Routines form specifically along the fault lines of these costs. The person who has learned that the morning hours in a particular household are most volatile builds a morning buffer, leaving early, maintaining surface calm, reducing exposure to the trigger window. The employee who knows that a certain kind of initiative will be punished routes their ambition through alternate channels or quietly redirects it into after-hours work that never enters the formal record. These are not small adaptations. They represent considerable organizational intelligence applied to the problem of surviving a specific environment. The sophistication of the adaptation is real. So is the cost. What makes the contract feel stable is the negotiated self-protection embedded in it. There is a known flaw. The person has found the positions, the phrases, the timing, and the silences that keep the worst outcomes at bay most of the time. This management system is so well integrated that it may no longer feel like management at all. It may feel like personality, like preference, like simply the way this person is. The careful one, the patient one. The one who does not make demands or who makes them only in certain ways at certain times after sufficient preparation. Examining a job that pays adequately but extracts several hours of psychological recovery for every workday reveals the full accounting. The salary is visible on a payslip. The recovery hours are invisible in the evening. The contract's total cost is the sum of both, and it is only when both are counted that a genuine assessment of the arrangement becomes possible. A relationship operates the same way. The visible benefits and the invisible expenditure together constitute the actual terms. Most people carrying a known pain contract have counted the benefits accurately. The expenditure column is often the one that has been deliberately left vague. not out of dishonesty, but because the full total is difficult to look at directly. The contract was not, in most cases, freely renewed at regular intervals. It was signed once, implicitly, and then continued by inertia, by obligation, by the accumulated weight of invested time, by the absence of a clear alternative, and by the quiet authority that familiarity carries. Which is the moment to ask, what is actually being preserved by honoring it? Among the things preserved by staying in a painful but predictable arrangement are several that are rarely named aloud, not because they are shameful in any absolute sense, but because acknowledging them feels incompatible with the narrative of suffering. Identity is one. A person whose story includes a particular difficulty, a demanding family, a punishing profession, an unresolvable conflict, has an organizing principle for that story. Remove the difficulty, and the organizing principle requires replacement, which is itself a kind of labor. The identity built around a known pain is not trivial. It has shaped how the person understands their own resilience, their own values, their relationships, and their place in social groups that recognize and respond to that particular story. Belonging is another benefit that the painful situation often provides. Groups form around shared difficulties. The colleagues who commiserate in the corridor after a difficult meeting, the partners in a friendship organized around mutual complaints about domestic life, the family members whose closeness is maintained partly through the shared weight of a particular dynamic. All of these relationships have the painful familiar situation woven into their texture. Leaving the situation may mean leaving, or at least straining, the relationships organized around it. The pain in this sense is doing social work. There is also the benefit of exemption from certain risks. A person who remains in a difficult situation has a ready explanation for not attempting things that might fail. The difficult situation accounts for the time, the energy, and the emotional resources that are unavailable. This is not cynical calculation. In most cases, it is entirely unconscious. But the painful, familiar arrangement does provide a genuine reason not to begin something new, not to risk public failure, not to endure beginner status in an unfamiliar domain. The situation is demanding. Realistically, more cannot be asked. This reasoning is often fair, and sometimes it is also convenient. What leaving would actually require includes the surrender of each of these benefits. The identity would need a new organizing principle. The belonging would need to be rebuilt, perhaps slowly, perhaps in communities that do not yet exist. The exemption from risk would expire, and the person would be required to be a beginner again in a domain where they currently have no established competence. Naming these losses is not a reason to stay. It is a reason to take the departure seriously, to understand that what is being asked of the person who leaves is genuinely substantial and not merely a decision. Becoming expert at surviving the wrong environment is a real and costly accomplishment. The expertise is not imaginary. It reflects years of precise observation, calibrated response, absorbed consequences, and accumulated adaptive intelligence. The person who can read a volatile manager's mood from 40 feet and adjust accordingly, who can de-escalate a domestic confrontation before it reaches its worst point, who can maintain productive output in conditions that would stop most people entirely, that person is demonstrating genuine skill. The problem is not that the skill is false. The problem is what the skill has been purchased with. Energy spent anticipating damage, preparing emotional insulation, managing the aftermath of repeated difficulty, monitoring for threat signals, and maintaining the particular vigilance that a painful environment requires is energy not spent elsewhere. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It has a practical dimension that is visible in what does not get done, what does not get attempted, what gets perpetually deferred to a quieter season that has a way of not arriving. The creative project, the professional development, the relationship that requires emotional presence that has already been spent, the physical health that suffers when recovery and management exhaust the available capacity. Comparing the energy consumed in managing a difficult environment with the energy that would be available in a genuinely safe one is an uncomfortable calculation, partly because it is speculative. What a person might accomplish in conditions that do not require constant management cannot be measured directly against what they have accomplished under the current conditions. The comparison requires imagination, and imagination in this direction has been inhibited by the same mechanism discussed earlier. The possible life is still blurry where the current one is painfully detailed. Years compound this disparity. A decade spent at peak adaptive intelligence navigating a bad situation is a decade of capacity poured into a container that has never been right-sized. The skill being developed is real but specific. It applies most precisely to the environment that required it. The skills that might have developed in its place, the professional domain explored more fully, the relational capacity built in healthier conditions, the creative or physical or intellectual competency that had room to grow, those remain hypothetical. Naming what has not been developed is not an exercise in self-pity. It is the honest accounting that the contract deserves, and the question that accounting opens is not abstract. What might become available if the structure being managed were replaced by one that did not require quite so much management? Chapter 4. The Life Without a Script. An unplanned morning in a new situation has a particular quality. The usual sequence of obligations, which once felt like pressure, now appears as the thing that was telling you who you were at 7:30 in the morning. Without it, the hour simply sits there. A person who has retired from a demanding career and found the first weeks not peaceful but vertiginous understands this precisely. The professional schedule was a container, and containers, once removed, reveal both the freedom they prevented and the structure they provided. The freedom is real, the vertigo is also real. And in the absence of a rehearsed script, the mind often interprets the openness as evidence that something has gone wrong. This interpretation is the perceptual mechanism at work. Unfamiliar does not equal unsafe, but it can feel like it with considerable force. The new situation, new city, new job level, new relationship status, new household configuration presents gaps in the script. Gaps get filled. The mind, working from the same cognitive tendency discussed earlier, fills them with anticipated loss rather than anticipated discovery. The missing details are rendered as dangers, the unresolved questions become worst-case projections, and what was objectively an open possibility begins to feel like a trap with no visible exit. Retirement, separation, career transition, and geographic relocation all produce versions of this experience. The person who left a damaging marriage describes a grief that surprised them. Not grief for the relationship, but for the rhythms, the known textures, the fights they had learned to exit gracefully. The professional who left a role they found demeaning describes a disorientation in the weeks afterward that felt wrong, even though what they left was objectively worse. These responses do not mean that leaving was a mistake. They are the normal phenomenology of having traded a detailed familiar experience for one that has not yet been filled in. What helps in this stage is distinguishing, as precisely as possible, between what is genuinely unknown and what has been added by projection. Some information about the new situation is actually missing and needs to be gathered. Financial projections need real numbers rather than imagined ones. Social consequences need to be assessed in conversation with actual people rather than hypothetical ones. Legal or practical obligations need professional guidance rather than anxious speculation. The category of real missing information is manageable. The category of imaginatively projected catastrophe is not manageable because it is not real. Separating them is an act of precision that reduces the subjective threat without dismissing the legitimate concerns. Remove the familiar role from a person's life and watch what happens to social recognition. In a workplace where someone has been the reliable expert for 15 years, they are addressed differently, deferred to in certain conversations, included in specific decisions. Their identity in that environment is partly social, maintained by the expectations, acknowledgements, and assumptions of the people around them. Walk away, and that maintenance structure disappears. The person remains, but the continuous social confirmation of who they are in that context does not follow them out the door. This loss is consistently underestimated. The professional identity, the relational identity in a long partnership, the community identity accumulated through years in a particular neighborhood or institution, these feel internal, but are partly external, held in place by the environment as much as by the person. When the environment changes, the internal experience of identity becomes temporarily unstable in a way that can feel like disintegration, but is more accurately a transitional state. The question is what the person is actually made of when the familiar context is no longer supplying the answer. The practical distinction here is between role competence and personal capacity. Role competence is specific, the particular skills, reflexes, and social intelligence developed inside a specific environment. Personal capacity is more transferable, the underlying ability to learn, to organize, to connect, to reason, to persist, to create, to repair. Most people who have spent years developing role competence have also been developing personal capacity alongside it, often without distinguishing the two. The role can be removed. The personal capacity generally cannot. Identifying what belongs to the role and what belongs to the person is one of the more clarifying exercises available during a transition. Discovering identity outside a familiar role requires something the familiar environment specifically discouraged: experimentation. In a stable environment, identity is maintained through consistency. In a transition, identity is built through contact, through attempting new things, observing what happens in the attempt, adjusting and attempting again. This is not the same as knowing who you will be on the other side. It is the process by which that knowledge becomes available. The experimental nature of this process is uncomfortable for someone whose identity has been structured around a known, reliable role. But the discomfort is not evidence of error. It is evidence of genuine work underway. Before any framework built around distinguishing familiarity from safety can be applied usefully, the real material risks of changing a situation must be assessed with honesty and precision. Financial consequences are the most concrete. A departure from a job means a specific income change with a specific timeline. A separation from a shared household means a specific reallocation of costs, legal arrangements, and potentially a custody or care structure that requires detailed planning. A relocation means specific expenses, specific disruptions to establish services and specific periods without the social infrastructure that currently provides support. These are not arguments against change. They are the terms of change, and they deserve precise attention rather than either dismissal or catastrophizing. Romantic escapes, the vision of the new life as simply lighter, cleaner, and uncomplicated, do not survive contact with their own material reality. Every life has operational costs. The new city has a lease, a utility setup, an unfamiliar public system, a social network that does not yet exist. The new relationship has its own set of patterns, some of which will not be visible for months or years. The new career path has an entry period during which the person is a beginner in a domain where they formerly had expertise. None of this means the change is wrong. It means the change is real, and real changes require preparation rather than fantasy. Gathering actual facts, consulting a financial advisor, speaking with a solicitor or attorney about legal obligations, researching housing markets, connecting with people who have made comparable transitions, transforms the decision from an imaginative exercise into an evidential one. Risk that has been measured is different in kind from risk that has only been imagined. Measured risk has a shape. Imagined risk expands to fill all available space. The distinction between manageable risk and fantasy catastrophe is built from research. A realistic worst case, costed and timed, is often substantially less severe than the projected version that has been carrying emotional weight for years. Building safeguards, financial reserves, professional advice, support structures, clear timelines for reassessment is not excessive caution. It is the practical infrastructure that allows a genuine decision to be made, rather than a desperate leap or an indefinite deferral. There is, however, a category of risk that must be treated as a different order of problem entirely. Situations involving physical safety, coercive control, documented harassment, or genuine danger. These require qualified support, legal, medical, counseling, or advocacy depending on the specifics, and they require planning that prioritizes safety above every other consideration. The Primer's framework of small experiments and gradual evidence gathering applies to situations where the cost is primarily psychological and financial. Where physical safety is at stake, different and more urgent processes apply, and the relevant professionals and support networks are where that conversation belongs. Chapter 5. The Safety Test. Safety, as an operational concept rather than a feeling, concerns the presence or absence of specific conditions: physical protection from harm, financial arrangements sufficient to prevent destitution, relational environments free of coercive control, and psychological conditions that allow a person to function without constant threat management. These are not abstract goods. Each one has observable indicators. Physical protection is present or absent in ways that can be documented. Financial stability has numbers attached to it. Coercive control has behavioral patterns that can be identified. Psychological safety has markers in whether a person can express disagreement, make mistakes, or articulate needs without consistent punishment. The first question the safety test asks is straightforward. In this situation, are your physical boundaries respected? Not in principle, not on best days, but as a consistent operational reality. If the answer requires significant qualification, mostly, usually, except when, then the qualification is itself information. A standard of physical safety that applies conditionally is not a standard of safety. It is a description of a pattern. The second question concerns recovery. When something goes wrong in this situation, a conflict, a financial setback, a professional failure, a health disruption, does the environment allow genuine recovery? Can you reorganize, seek support, make errors, and return to functional equilibrium without the recovery itself becoming a source of new danger or punishment? Environments that punish the need for recovery are more costly than they appear, because they eliminate the repair mechanisms that every human being requires. The third question is directional. Is the risk in this situation stable, improving, or worsening over time? A situation with significant problems that are genuinely improving is different from a situation with the same profile of problems that are worsening, or that cycle without net change. The direction of travel is among the most important pieces of information available, and it requires honesty to assess, particularly when improvement is incremental and hope has learned to be satisfied with small movements. Where serious safety concerns are present, connecting with qualified professionals is not optional preparation for a decision. It is the appropriate first step. Predictability as a dimension of safety concerns a specific capacity, the ability to forecast likely outcomes with enough accuracy to make informed decisions. A situation is predictable not because it is pleasant, but because its behavior across time follows patterns that can be identified and anticipated. This is the territory where the familiar, painful situation often appears deceptively superior to unfamiliar alternatives, because one can be predicted and the other cannot, and the mind treats predictability as though it were protection. The critical distinction is between predictable harm and unpredictable but bounded change. Predictable harm knows its schedule, but the harm continues. Its predictability offers the preparation advantage described earlier, but it does not reduce the harm itself, and in some situations it increases cumulative damage over time precisely because the preparation appears to be working while the underlying conditions worsen. Unbounded unpredictability, a situation where outcomes are genuinely unknowable and consequences could escalate without limit, is legitimately dangerous. But most transitions fall into a third category, unpredictable in their details, but bounded by practical constraints that make catastrophic outcomes less likely than they feel. Comparing these conditions with actual evidence rather than projected emotion requires a specific kind of inventory. What has the predictable situation produced concretely over the past year or two? What has been lost, spent, avoided, suppressed, or deferred during that period? Now consider the most realistic version of the alternative. Not the worst case, not the best case, but the likely case with genuine preparation. Compare evidence with evidence rather than certainty with fear. The question of which condition allows more agency, more ability to act, to adjust, to influence outcomes, is often revelatory. In a predictable, harmful situation, agency is frequently constrained precisely because the energy is consumed in management. In a bounded, unfamiliar situation, agency may be genuinely greater, even though the uncertainty is higher, because the management demands are lower and more capacity is available for navigation. Comfort is a legitimate consideration in any life. It cannot be the sole criterion. An existence organized around maintaining one kind of comfort, while other essential conditions deteriorate, is not a comfortable existence. It is a managed one. The third dimension of the safety test concerns whether the structure responds meaningfully to honest feedback. This question applies to workplaces, relationships, families, communities, and institutions alike. When a concern is raised clearly and in good faith, what happens? Does the environment acknowledge the concern, engage with it genuinely, and produce a change that lasts? Or does it generate temporary adjustment, followed by return to the previous pattern, or defense, dismissal, and withdrawal? Responsiveness is not the same as agreement. An environment may push back on feedback, argue about interpretation, express disagreement, and still be genuinely responsive if the engagement is honest, the other party remains willing to examine their own behavior, and change actually occurs as a result of sustained, honest exchange. What distinguishes responsiveness from its simulation is whether the change persists and whether the relationship can hold the honesty without requiring the person who raised the concern to manage the consequences of having raised it. Repair and accountability, similarly, are not demonstrated by apology alone. An apology followed by the same behavior is a pattern of apology, not a pattern of repair. Genuine repair requires behavioral change that holds over time and does not require repeated renegotiation of the same boundary. In workplaces, accountability means more than acknowledgement. It means adjusted policy, modified behavior from those responsible, and organizational memory that does not allow the same harm to be repeated as though it had never occurred. The distinction between imperfection and rigidity is one of the most practically useful the safety test offers. Every relationship, every institution, every professional arrangement is imperfect. Imperfection that responds to feedback, however slowly and imperfectly, is categorically different from a structure that simply does not change in response to what its members need. The first is a living arrangement. The second is a fixed one. A fixed structure can sometimes be renovated, and sometimes it cannot. The question the safety test poses is which kind of structure is being inhabited. Not in its best moments, but in its operational average across time. When honest feedback produces nothing but the requirement to manage the consequences of having offered it, that pattern is itself information of considerable importance. Chapter 6. When staying is not fear. There are periods in adult life when the perception of a situation is temporarily distorted not by the situation itself, but by the person's current capacity to engage with it. A caregiver 18 months into a sustained and demanding caregiving role, an employee navigating a particularly difficult organizational moment, a parent in the middle of a developmental crisis with a child, these people are making assessments of their lives from a position of genuine depletion. Their perception is real, the fatigue is not invented, but the conclusions drawn from that perception may not survive a different physical and emotional season. The appropriate test in these circumstances is not to decide whether to stay or leave based on how everything looks from the lowest point. It is to build in sufficient rest, social support, and reduction of secondary demands, and then reassess from that improved position. A decision made from maximum exhaustion carries the perceptual distortions of that state. Everything that requires energy appears impossible. Everything that offers relief appears necessary. These are the conditions under which the familiar, even if genuinely harmful, can look disproportionately attractive because it at least carries a flaw. Caregiving seasons, intensive work periods, health crises, and extended relational strain are not necessarily evidence of a wrong life. They are conditions with their own temporary logic, and the honest assessment of whether the situation underneath them is viable requires waiting until they have eased enough to look clearly. This is not the same as deferral disguised as patience. It requires active work, securing genuine support, establishing recovery conditions, reducing the additional load where possible, and setting a specific future point at which the assessment will be revisited with fresh information and restored capacity. The distinction between temporary depletion and chronic conditions matters precisely here. A season of exhaustion is bounded. It has a foreseeable end, or it can be given one through deliberate intervention. A chronic condition has no foreseeable end under current arrangements. The fatigue is structural rather than seasonal. The demands do not have an expiration point, and rest provides only partial and temporary recovery. The chronic condition requires a different analysis than the temporary one, and conflating the two in either direction, treating seasonal depletion as permanent or treating chronic damage as a bad season, produces serious errors in the assessment. For situations that appear chronic, building in a review point is still valuable, but the review must include the question of whether the conditions producing the chronic state are within the current arrangement's capacity to change. Some arrangements can be modified to reduce chronic load. Others cannot, not because of anyone's bad faith, but because the structure of the situation is incompatible with the person's long-term sustainability inside it. That possibility deserves honest examination rather than indefinite postponement. Commitment that has been examined in current conditions, that is sustained by present reasons rather than historical inertia, and that is held alongside the capacity for future revision, is a different thing from the frozen continuation of an arrangement that was never consciously renewed. A person who stays in a long partnership because the partnership is genuinely meeting the conditions of a good life, with difficulty, with imperfection, with real work, is exercising a different faculty than the person who stays because leaving is too disorienting to imagine. Both may look the same from the outside. They are not the same operation. Mutual response is among the most reliable markers of living commitment. In a relationship or institution where commitment is active rather than inert, the other parties also adapt, invest, and remain engaged with what the person needs from the arrangement. The commitment is held by both sides, renegotiated implicitly or explicitly as conditions change, and demonstrated in behavior rather than simply declared. When that mutuality is present, the stability it produces is genuinely different from the stability of an arrangement too rigid to move. Present reasons for staying are different from historical reasons. The investment of the past decade is a historical reason. The quality of the current relationship is a present reason. The difficulty of starting again is a historical future reason rooted in what has been accumulated and what departure would cost. None of these reasons are without legitimacy, but they carry different weights in an honest assessment. A commitment supported primarily by present reasons, by what the arrangement actually provides now, by what the other parties are actually doing now, by what the person actually values now, is a commitment that can be held with integrity rather than resignation. Long partnerships and long crafts share a similar quality in this respect. A person who has practiced a difficult skill for 20 years and continues to find it genuinely engaging, even in its frustrations, is not afraid to leave. They simply have not found a reason to. The distinction is not always visible from the outside, but it is felt clearly from inside. Fear-based continuation has a particular texture. The closing off of alternatives, the inability to imagine the self outside the current arrangement, the monitoring of departure as a threat rather than as a theoretical possibility. Commitment, built on present reason, has a different texture. The genuine preference for what is here, alongside the knowledge that alternatives exist and have been considered. The alternative life, as it tends to be imagined in moments of frustration or pain, carries a specific kind of lighting. Details that would be tedious or difficult in the current situation simply do not appear in the imagined version. The new career is pictured in its most engaging moments, not in its learning curve, its administrative requirements, its Monday mornings, its equivalent version of the thing that is most draining in the current career. The new relationship is pictured in its early ease, not in the negotiation of habits, the integration of histories, the ordinary evenings that follow the initial period of mutual novelty. Removing this fantasy lighting from the comparison is not pessimism. It is the precondition for an honest one. What does the ordinary Thursday of the alternative look like? Not the good one, not the worst one, but the unremarkable one. Does it still compare favorably when rendered at the resolution of the current life's ordinary Thursday? This question does not argue for staying. It argues for comparing lives that have been given equal clarity. Boredom, logistical friction, interpersonal difficulty, and periodic low-grade disappointment are features of every life. They are not evidence that the right life has not yet been found. They are conditions of living, and the question is not how to eliminate them, but which version of them belongs to a life whose other qualities make those ordinary difficulties worth carrying. The distinction between escaping temporary discomfort and making a genuine necessary change is one of the primer's most important. A difficult month in an otherwise viable arrangement is a reason to address the month's specific problems, not to redesign the entire arrangement. A pattern of difficulty sustained across years without genuine improvement, or a single feature of the arrangement that is genuinely incompatible with the person's integrity, well-being, or safety. These are different orders of problem. Desire for novelty is real and human. It is not by itself evidence that the current situation is wrong or that the imagined alternative would be better. Evidence for an alternative comes from contact with it, not from projection about it, which is precisely why controlled experimentation is the next necessary territory. Chapter 7. Test without destroying. A reversible experiment is an action taken in the direction of an untested possibility that can be undone or paused without catastrophic consequence. It is the methodological answer to the problem of comparing a detailed familiar life with a blurry, unfamiliar one. Bring the unfamiliar into focus through actual contact rather than continued projection. The experiment might be a course taken one evening per week in a field being considered. It might be a temporary reduction in working hours to assess what additional time produces. It might be a new morning routine, a new social context, a new creative practice, a new professional connection. Any action that generates lived information about an unexplored territory without requiring the abandonment of the current arrangement to take it. The practical examples are deliberately ordinary. A person considering a career change does not begin by resigning. They begin by spending 6 months in professional contact with the target field, attending events, speaking with practitioners, attempting a small project within it, and comparing what that contact produces emotionally and practically with what the current career produces on the same dimensions. A person considering relocation does not sell the house first. They spend a weekend in the candidate city, then a longer stay, building real experiential data about what ordinary life there would be like. These are not compromises or half measures. They are the conditions under which an honest comparison becomes possible for the first time. Recording the emotional and practical results of experiments is essential. Memory of early experiences in unfamiliar territory is unreliable, partly because the anxiety of novelty colors the early impressions, and partly because evidence that contradicts an existing narrative tends to be unconsciously weighted against confirming evidence. Writing down what actually happened, what was engaging, what was draining, what surprised, what confirmed the projection, and what contradicted it, builds an evidential record that can be consulted over weeks and months rather than interpreted freshly from a position of current emotion. Secret double lives, which are their own category of problem, need to be distinguished from legitimate experimentation. An experiment conducted transparently within the bounds of existing commitments and ethical obligations is a reasonable form of exploration, an experiment that requires sustained concealment, the violation of an existing agreement, or the deception of people who have legitimate claims on honesty is a different thing entirely. Its emotional costs, quite apart from its ethical ones, tend to compound in ways that contaminate the evidence the experiment was meant to produce. The experiment should be able to bear the light of the existing situation. Where it cannot, the ethical dimension requires attention before the experimental one. A boundary experiment is a specific kind of test, changing one condition in a current arrangement and observing what happens in response. The condition changed should be specific and limited, a single behavior adjusted, a single request made, a single area of capacity withdrawn or extended. The purpose is not to destabilize the arrangement. It is to gather information about how the arrangement actually functions when one variable is altered. This information is not available through imagination or inference. It is available only through the change itself. The observation that follows the change must be conducted with care. Two responses are possible, and they are categorically different. Discomfort, the other party's uncertainty, adjustment period, temporary friction, expressed concern about the change, is a normal feature of any relationship or institution responding to something new. It does not indicate that the experiment was wrong or that the boundary was inappropriate. Retaliation, punishment, withdrawal of support, escalation designed to reinstate the original condition is a different response. It tells the person something important about how the structure responds to their exercise of agency within it. A workplace example. A person who has consistently worked well beyond their contracted hours experiments with leaving consistently on time for 2 weeks. The discomfort response is a conversation about expectations, perhaps some expressed confusion or mild pressure. The retaliation response is diminished opportunity, exclusion from meetings, altered tone from a supervisor, or implicit penalty to the relationship. Observing which pattern is present provides more information about the workplace's actual character than years of narrative interpretation. The same logic applies to relationships. One partner, who has habitually suppressed a particular preference to avoid conflict, expresses that preference clearly on one occasion. Does the conversation that follows produce genuine engagement, even difficult engagement, or does it produce a pattern of pressure to withdraw the preference? The response is information. Protect safety throughout this process. Where the structure being tested has demonstrated a capacity for coercive or harmful response, the experiment design must account for that risk explicitly, and qualified support should be in place before proceeding. Among the most informative experiments available is the simplest, an hour or a morning, that belongs entirely outside the familiar role. No fixing, no managing, no performing competence for the benefit of the environment. This is not productivity structured in a new direction. It is the removal of the functional role entirely, leaving the person with whatever remains when the familiar job description is set aside. What appears in that space is among the most direct evidence available about what exists beyond the role. Desire and anxiety often arrive together in this space. The desire is for something, however vague, a kind of activity, a kind of contact, a kind of quiet, a kind of creative engagement that the usual role never makes room for. The anxiety is equally real. The unfamiliar space, the absence of the script, the discomfort of having no managed task to perform, both are worth noting. Neither is the final verdict on anything. The desire is information. The anxiety is also information. The question is not which feeling to obey, but what both feelings are pointing at. Avoiding the productivity pressure that tends to colonize any unstructured time is part of the experiment's design. The person accustomed to being the reliable one finds it genuinely difficult to simply be in unstructured space without converting it into another form of useful output. That conversion instinct is itself worth observing. Why does empty time feel wrong? What is the quiet assumption that time without function carries no value? These are questions the role-free hour makes available for inspection. Take one unfamiliar action in this time, something unrelated to the usual role, something small and low stakes, a different walking route, a conversation with someone outside the usual social ecosystem, a creative attempt, a physical practice, an inquiry into a domain that has been postponed indefinitely. Observe what happens in the body, in the mood, in the quality of attention. Note what expands, what produces more sense of aliveness, more genuine engagement, more interest in continuing. This is the beginning of building a personal evidence base for what the untested life might actually contain. Here is the reflective invitation embedded in this work. What is the predictable pain you know how to manage better than you know how to manage the uncertainty outside it? Identify it specifically, not in general, but by name, by pattern, by the particular cost you have become expert at absorbing. Write it down privately. That identification is not an accusation. It is the first act of genuine diagnosis, and it belongs only to you. What the evidence gathered through these experiments gradually begins to replace is not the familiar itself, but the fantasy of the unfamiliar, the projection, the worst case, the blurred, threatening alternative. Evidence is more legible than imagination. Legibility is what makes genuine choice possible. Chapter 8. When the old script protests. When experimentation begins in earnest, when a boundary is tested, a role-free hour is taken, a course is enrolled in, a preference is expressed that the familiar environment would have required suppressing, guilt tends to arrive quickly. Its arrival feels like moral information, that something wrong has been done, that someone has been harmed, that the experiment itself was a violation of something that deserved protection. This feeling deserves to be taken seriously enough to examine carefully, not seriously enough to accept uncritically as a verdict. The examination requires one central question: has anyone been actually harmed by the change, or has a role been disrupted? These are not the same thing. The fixer who does not fix on one occasion has disrupted the role. Whether anyone has been harmed by the absence of fixing depends on what was being fixed, whether it genuinely required the person to fix it, and whether the harm would have occurred without their intervention, or was produced by a dynamic that the fixing was perpetuating. Disrupting a role can produce discomfort in those who relied on it. And sometimes that discomfort is not evidence of wrongdoing, but evidence of dependency that was itself worth examining. Where genuine harm has occurred, where an experiment went further than was careful, where an obligation was left genuinely unmet, where a person in legitimate need was affected by the change, repair is appropriate. Repair means addressing the actual harm directly, acknowledging it, making genuine amends where possible, and adjusting the experiment design to prevent the same harm in future iterations. Guilt used as a signal to repair real harm is functioning correctly. Guilt used as a signal to abandon all experimentation and return to the original role configuration is functioning as the old script's enforcement mechanism, not as a moral compass. Refusing guilt as an automatic verdict does not mean refusing accountability. It means distinguishing between the experience of guilt and the question of whether the guilt is pointing at a real harm or at a disrupted expectation. A person who has spent years in the appeasing role will feel guilt when they cease appeasing, not because they have done something wrong, but because the role's internal logic treats role departure as wrongdoing. Learning to make this distinction is one of the practical competencies the primer builds. Social groups often form, partly or entirely, around the roles people perform within them. The work group whose cohesion is partly built around shared endurance of a difficult environment. The family subsystem whose closeness is organized partly around a particular dynamic. The friendship network whose texture depends on a specific cast of characters in their familiar positions. All of these structures are affected when one member begins to change their role. The change does not have to be announced dramatically to be socially legible. Behavioral shifts in familiar environments are noticed, and they generate responses. The social consequences of role change are real and deserve honest anticipation. Some relationships will carry the change without difficulty. Others will create pressure to return to the previous configuration. Others may become unavailable, not through anyone's malice, but because the basis for the connection was the shared situation that no longer exists or the role that is no longer being performed. These losses are genuine losses, and minimizing them in advance does not help with navigating them when they arrive. Building new social contact gradually, before the old contact fully falls away, is more sustainable than waiting until a social vacuum is present and then filling it urgently. This is one of the practical arguments for slow experimentation rather than sudden departure. New communities can be entered while old ones are still present, and the transition is experienced as expansion rather than replacement. The arrival in a new professional environment, a new neighborhood, a new interest community is easier when it is done from a position of some existing social stability rather than from the complete absence of the old structure. Contempt for the people connected to the old arrangement, the colleagues who remain in the situation being left, the family members who still perform the roles that are being questioned, the friends who are not yet examining their own familiar pain, is worth actively resisting. People do not examine what they are not yet ready to examine. and the examination that one person is doing now was not always being done. Contempt for where others are is generally contempt for where the person doing the examining once was, and it tends to produce its own isolation. Transitional loneliness, the specific solitude of being between social worlds, is temporary by nature, provided the work of building new contact is begun early and continued steadily. After the first genuine change, the first experiment that produces visible results, the first boundary held, the first role-free time taken, the first departure from the rehearsed script, discomfort arrives that is sufficiently strong to produce a clear impulse. Return to what was before, undo the change, restore the familiar configuration. The impulse is not irrational. It is the product of the same familiarity safety confusion that the primer has been examining throughout. The old arrangement was uncomfortable, but the discomfort was known. This new discomfort is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar discomfort has the perceptual quality of danger. The particular mechanism at work is the way familiarity misrepresents itself at moments of return temptation. After the change, the old life does not present itself with full accuracy. It presents the parts that provided comfort, orientation, and social belonging, the floor plan, the rehearsed responses, the known costs. It does not simultaneously present the reasons the experiment began, the costs that accumulated before the change, the chronic conditions that no longer had to be managed during the experimental period. The familiar calls with selective memory, and the call sounds from inside the new discomfort, like it is speaking truth about where the person belongs. The practical response to this impulse is waiting before reversing, not permanent waiting, not permanent deferral of comfort, but a specific pause, a week, 2 weeks, a defined period before making any decision to return. During that pause, review the evidence collected before and during the experiment. Not the felt sense of the current moment, but the record, what the situation was producing before the change, what the experiment has produced since, what specific evidence supports the proposed return as distinct from the discomfort of novelty. This review will not always argue for continuing the experiment. Sometimes the evidence genuinely supports recalibration. But recalibration made from a review of evidence is a different act from retreat made under the pressure of discomfort that has been misread as truth. Real danger is its own category, where the experiment has produced genuine safety risk, where retaliation has gone beyond discomfort into genuine harm. The appropriate response is to prioritize safety, which may mean a different kind of change rather than a return. Chapter 9. Making the New Life Legible. One of the paradoxes of transition is that the very quality that makes the old life feel safe, its predictability, its routines, its reliable rhythms, is also a quality the new life needs to develop in order to become livable. Structure is not the enemy of freedom. A life without any predictable elements is experienced as exhausting rather than liberating, because every decision must be made fresh and every environment entered without the benefit of repeated familiarity. The task in building a new life is not to eliminate structure, but to build structure that does not trap. Creating healthy routine in the new context is a practical act of pattern building, the morning sequence that signals the beginning of the day, the weekly schedule that creates reliable points of rest, work, social contact, and personal time, the recurring commitments, a community meeting, a practice, a regular call with someone whose company is genuinely sustaining, that provide the kind of predictable texture the old life once provided, without requiring the management costs the old life imposed. These are not replacements for the familiar, painful structure. They are new structures chosen rather than inherited. Building predictable supports, people, practices, financial buffers, review habits, transforms an amorphous new situation into one that has legible features. The support network need not be large. Several reliable points of contact are more valuable than many unreliable ones. The financial buffer need not be substantial. A defined minimum that prevents crisis provides the same orientational function as a much larger reserve. The review habit, a monthly or quarterly hour spent assessing how the current arrangements are functioning and what adjustments are warranted, prevents the new structure from quietly calcifying into another arrangement that nobody consciously chose. The risk in this building process is the reproduction of a rigid role inside the new context. The fixer who moves to a new environment and immediately reconstitutes a fixing dynamic with new parties has transferred the role rather than examined it. The schedule that is so packed with new commitments that the role-free hour disappears again has restored the old pressure in new clothing. The new structure should be checked regularly, not only for whether it is functioning, but for whether it is allowing the person to be present to their own choices or simply executing a new set of obligations with equal automaticity. Arriving in a new domain without the competence that has organized a professional or personal identity for years is genuinely disorienting. The person who was the acknowledged expert in their previous position, who moved through that environment with the specific authority of accumulated knowledge, arrives in the new context and is indistinguishable from anyone else who is just beginning. They do not know the unwritten rules, the informal hierarchies, the practical shortcuts, the names that matter. This is not a failure of character. It is the mathematical consequence of being new to something. Every person who is good at anything was once bad at it and passed through the beginner stage. The knowledge does not make the experience more comfortable. Separating beginner status from worth is the essential cognitive work of this period. Beginner status describes a position in a learning curve. Worth describes something else entirely, a set of capacities, values, accumulated wisdom, and relational qualities that are not altered by the current position on a particular learning curve. A senior professional entering a new field as a junior is not less valuable as a person because they are junior in that field. A person re-entering a social community after years of relative isolation is not less capable of genuine connection because they have not yet established themselves in that community. The confusion between beginner status and diminished worth is among the most common and most damaging that transition produces. Career transitions and social reintegrations both provide examples of this. The attorney who moves into non-profit work in their 50s encounters moments of not knowing what people who are decades younger have been doing for their entire careers. The person who leaves a long marriage and re-enters the social world of unpartnered adults encounters norms and practices that everyone else appears to navigate fluently. These encounters produce a specific humility that can feel like incompetence. The distinction matters. Humility before a genuine learning curve is appropriate and leads somewhere. The belief that not knowing something means being fundamentally unequal to the task does not lead anywhere useful. Tracking small competence gains. Actively noting when a thing that was difficult last month is easier this month, when a question that required help last quarter can now be answered independently, builds the experiential evidence that beginning does not mean remaining at the beginning. Awkwardness is the natural texture of learning, and accepting it as such rather than reading it as proof of a fundamental mismatch between the person and the new context shortens the period of distress without accelerating the learning in any artificial way. The temptation of instant transformation, the belief that enough motivation or enough correct thinking should produce fluency quickly, is worth actively resisting. Evidence of gradual competence is more durable than the performance of instant confidence. Recording what actually happens across weeks, across the first months of a transition, builds an archive that serves a specific function, correcting the projections that preceded the change. The fear that surrounded the untested territory made specific predictions. The new job would be isolating. The new city would feel foreign for years. The post-departure financial situation would be unmanageable. The social world on the other side of a relationship change would be barren. Some of these predictions were accurate, some were not. The record makes it possible to see which is which, rather than continuing to operate from an anxiety that was formed before any evidence was available. Comparing predictions with experience is not an exercise in proving the fear wrong. It is an exercise in updating the risk assessment with real information. Where the fear was accurate, where a genuine difficulty has materialized, the record helps clarify what kind of difficulty it is and what responses are appropriate. Where the fear was exaggerated, where the projected catastrophe did not arrive, or arrived in a substantially smaller form than imagined, the record makes that discrepancy visible, which reduces the authority of the next projection. Fear that has been wrong several specific times carries less weight in the next decision. Updating the risk assessment over time produces a more nuanced picture than either the pre-change projection or the post-change emotional impression. The update might reveal that one dimension of the change was well managed, while another was underestimated and needs more active attention. It might reveal that a particular support was essential and needs to be reinforced. It might reveal that a specific assumption about what the new situation would require was wrong in a direction that is actually useful. The caution that good risk assessment produces is not timidity. It is the appropriate response to information. Expand what is working, address what is not, and do both from a position of evidence rather than projection. Final chapter: safety you can recognize. By this point in the primer, safety has been given a working definition that is considerably more precise than the feeling of familiarity it was often confused with. Reviewing its components makes the criteria available as a practical tool rather than an abstract concept. Protection first. Is the physical, financial, and psychological integrity of the person maintained in this arrangement on a consistent operational basis, not only in its best moments? Responsiveness follows. When a concern, a need, or a change in behavior is introduced, does the structure engage with it genuinely? Does engagement produce lasting modification, or does the structure revert? A structure that consistently reverts is not responding. It is waiting. Integrity, the alignment between what the arrangement claims to offer and what it actually produces, sits alongside responsiveness as a separate question. An arrangement that describes itself as supportive and regularly produces exhaustion is not an arrangement of integrity in any practically meaningful sense. The claim and the record must be compared, and the record carries more evidential weight. Agency matters in a way that is often underestimated. Does the current arrangement allow the person to make genuine decisions, to choose, to adjust, to express preference, to exercise judgment? Or are the decisions available within the arrangement consistently constrained by the requirement to maintain the arrangement's stability? Agency is not unlimited in any circumstance. What the criterion asks is whether the range of decision-making available to the person is increasing or narrowing over time. Recovery. Whether the arrangement allows the person to fail, adjust, seek support and return to functional capacity without the recovery itself generating new threat, is one of the most revealing measures of structural safety. And future capacity. Does the arrangement leave the person with greater capacity at the end of a year than at the beginning? More range, more learning, more possibility? Or does it consume capacity without adding any? 3 legitimate outcomes are available from an honest application of the safety criteria. Staying with the current arrangement confirmed as meeting the essential criteria, even if imperfectly. Redesigning, remaining in the broad situation, but renegotiating specific conditions that currently fail the criteria, with genuine commitment and response from the other parties. Leaving, departing from the arrangement when redesign has been genuinely attempted and the structure has demonstrated that it cannot or will not meet the essential conditions. Each outcome has its own evidentiary standard. Staying is supported by evidence that the criteria are being met in their meaningful operational average, not in their ideal version, but in their reliable pattern across time. Redesign is supported by evidence that the structure is genuinely responsive and that specific, named changes are achievable within it, matched with a clear timeline and review point. Leaving is supported by evidence that the essential conditions cannot be created within the current arrangement. Not by evidence of difficulty alone, not by the desire for novelty, but by the consistent failure of the structure to respond to honest, direct attempts at necessary change. Consequences require honest inclusion in each outcome. Staying carries the consequence of continued investment in this particular arrangement and the continued limitation of what cannot be pursued while inside it. Redesigning carries the consequence of the effort and uncertainty of renegotiation and the possibility that the response will not be sufficient. Leaving carries the practical, financial, social, and identity consequences that have been assessed as manageable through earlier preparation. None of the 3 outcomes is cost-free. The question is, Which costs are appropriate given what the evidence has demonstrated? Duties and obligations belong in the accounting. Dependence, contractual commitments, legal responsibilities, and genuine relational debts are real factors. Acknowledging them is not an argument for indefinitely postponing a decision. It is the basis for responsible planning, determining which obligations are non-negotiable, which can be managed across a transition, which require specific legal or professional guidance, and which timeline is therefore realistic. Support, professional, relational, practical, should be identified and engaged before a decision of this magnitude is finalized rather than after, when the full weight of its consequences has arrived. The competency that the primer has been building is not a simple formula for when to stay or leave. It is something more portable than that. The capacity to read a situation through evidence rather than familiarity, to test an unfamiliar possibility without catastrophic disruption, and to distinguish the discomfort of genuine risk from the discomfort of the unfamiliar. These are the distinguishing marks of a person who is no longer entirely dependent on predictability as their primary safety mechanism. Dependence on prediction has not disappeared. A full human life continues to rely on structure, routine, reasonable certainty, and social belonging. What has changed is the exclusive authority that prediction previously held. The person who has completed the primer's process can tolerate a broader range of uncertainty without treating that uncertainty as equivalent to danger. They have gathered actual evidence from previously untested territory. That evidence has corrected specific projections. The corrected projections make future unfamiliar territory somewhat less threatening, not because it has been made safe by definition, but because the mechanism by which the unfamiliar was being misread as dangerous has been identified and examined. Prudence remains. The primer has not argued for the embrace of recklessness, and it does not now. The person who can test is not the person who finds uncertainty exciting or who dismisses caution as limiting. They are the person who can distinguish between genuine danger and unfamiliar ground, and who can approach the latter with planned, bounded, reversible steps rather than either paralysis or reckless departure. Incomplete certainty is the permanent condition of every consequential decision. Waiting for complete certainty before acting produces indefinite deferral, because complete certainty about complex arrangements is not available. What is available is sufficient evidence gathered carefully to make a decision one can stand behind. Return now to the scene at the beginning, the repeated pattern, the rehearsed sequence, the floor plan of the familiar pain. That scene has not changed. What has changed is the person looking at it. They can now ask with greater precision whether that pain constitutes safety in any meaningful operational sense, whether it meets the criteria of protection, responsiveness, integrity, agency, recovery, and future capacity, or whether it meets only the criterion of predictability while failing the others. The answer may be that the situation is worth staying in and working on, or it may not. Either way, the choice is no longer being made by default. It is being made by evidence, and the person making it is no longer choosing between known pain and imagined danger. They are choosing between two realities, each of which they can now read. Epilogue. The primer closes. The scene at the opening of this primer has not resolved itself. The pattern still exists. The conversation still follows its known sequence. The familiar discomfort still arrives on schedule and lands where it has always landed. What has changed is not the scene's content, but the criteria being brought to it. The question is no longer whether the situation is familiar. The question is whether it is protective, whether it meets the conditions of an arrangement worth inhabiting on its own terms, independent of how well its floor plan has been memorized. Familiar and safe have been separated. They look similar from the inside of a life organized around prediction, but they measure different things entirely. One measures how well a situation has been rehearsed. The other measures whether the situation is actually sustaining the person who has been rehearsing it. The primer has offered the tools to make that distinction with precision: protection, responsiveness, integrity, agency, recovery, and future capacity. Apply them to what you know best, to the pain whose schedule you can recite. The familiarity of the answer is no longer a reason to trust it uncritically. Uncertainty does not resolve itself from a distance. The unfamiliar life does not become legible through imagination. It becomes legible through bounded contact, through experiments that are reversible, ethical, evidence-generating, and honest. The master question that opened this primer: how does something painful come to feel safer than an alternative that may offer more, now has a working answer. Because the painful thing has been practiced, and practice produces the experience of competence, and competence is confused with appropriateness. The alternative has not been practiced, and the absence of practice is confused with danger. This is not an argument to depart. It is an argument to test, carefully, honestly, with attention to real consequences and genuine duties. Some testing will confirm that the current arrangement, imperfect as it is, meets the essential criteria and deserves continued and better chosen investment. Other testing will produce evidence that the arrangement cannot provide what is needed, which is also valuable information. Either result is more useful than a life organized around a distinction that was never examined. The untested does not have to remain untested. That much is now within reach. There is a question worth leaving with, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to the work that continues after this primer closes. What is the predictable pain you know how to manage better than you know how to manage the uncertainty outside it? Name it in the comments if you are willing, privately or in whatever form allows honesty. Not to confess and not to be advised, but because naming the specific known pain is the beginning of seeing it clearly rather than simply carrying it. The work of the primer is not finished in a single sitting. It accumulates in the noticing. The next distinction in this series concerns something that operates alongside familiarity with considerable skill at disguise: guilt that wears the name of responsibility. The person who knows how to manage a predictable pain often stays not only because the situation is familiar, but because leaving feels like a moral failure, like the abandonment of a duty that may or may not be as binding as it presents itself. That question deserves its own careful examination, and it is where the next book begins.